Opponents of euthanasia are warning that politicians haven't taken their concerns into account after voting through David Seymour's bill. Lawyers, doctors and now a mental health nurse have spoken up, believing they can still convince a majority of voters to say no to voluntary euthanasia at next year's referendum. But David Seymour says they are scaremongering and all the facts are on his side of the debate. Alex Perrottet reports.
David Seymour says it's been 4 years of long suffering.
Hugely thankful to the multi-party team, to my staff, to the Epsom electorate and the ACT party for getting me elected and making it all possible. And for people such as Russell McLeod, who've given us huge amounts of pro bono help.
But opponents are dismayed. Dr. Shanae Donnelly says this week her online letter attracted its 1,500th signature. That's 1,500 doctors who say no to euthanasia.
Reaching that target at this time just reflects the deep concern of doctors about the role that this bill implicates them in and the impact that it will have on the practice of medicine. This bill actually puts, a knife through the heart of medicine.
Dion Howard is a registered nurse working in mental health and says 21 mental health workers penned another letter to MPs ahead of last night's vote, warning of what they say are links between euthanasia and the suicide rate in some countries. He says he has first-hand experience of his young clients using the same reasons for their suicidal inclinations as euthanasia advocates.
So they'd use things like bodily autonomy and unbearable suffering, and quite articulately as well. So, of course, that when you're working with someone who has chronic suicidality, you factor in every possible risk that may sort of shift that needle for them.
He says the government has a duty of care for the vulnerable and says David Seymour hasn't proven that the regime of euthanasia in the law is safe.
Our Prime Minister has said one suicide is one too many. We have a trending suicide rate that, is the worst that it's been since the 1990s, and yet we're just so readily dismissing a duty of care. And that's simply what we're saying is the onus of proof rests on the proponents of the bill, not the opponents, to say that it is safe.
But David Seymour says the debate has been rigorous and so is his law, and claims that an increased suicide rate relates to euthanasia are not rigorous.
Let's be honest, they are now using terms like suggestive evidence. Now, that is not an academic term. That is not evidence. That is speculation masquerading as evidence. And just because somebody has some expertise in a field doesn't mean they have expertise in another field, such as analysing the actual connection between statistics.
A spokesperson for Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders, Richard McLeod, says their concerns around coercion weren't dealt with in the Committee of the Whole House, despite many supplementary order papers. He says many people could be taken advantage of.
Coercion and pressure in our vulnerable communities is a really serious and growing problem. We've got the widespread coercive forces of elder abuse. We've got the coercive forces of loneliness and marginalisation, especially amongst our elderly. We've got the coercive force of not wanting to be a burden. And, of course, we've got the coercive force, particularly on Māori, of a healthcare system which is increasingly failing them. And these profound coercive forces already at work need to be checked. And this bill fails dismally in checking them.
But David Seymour says there's no evidence for that.
Actually, the people who avail themselves of assisted dying are people who have the assertiveness in their character, the education, the resources to navigate a fairly arduous system of bureaucratic checks and balances to become eligible.
Dr. Shanae Donnelly says she was in the public gallery of Parliament yesterday when MPs were debating and says she's sad that medical professionals have not been respected.
And really just dismayed that people who are lay people, even though they're MPs, would speak in such a, disrespectful way about a group of people who dedicate their life in the service of people who are vulnerable and sick.
David Seymour assures that he and the 68 other MPs who voted in favour are on the right side of history. He says there's 150 million people living in jurisdictions around the world where assisted dying is now legal, though the Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders say that leaves billions of others around the world who don't. Here in New Zealand, there's over 3.5 million eligible voters set to tick a box next year on their ballot papers, with likely another public debate about just how that tricky question is likely to be worded. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.